Welcome back to Dragon Dreams. Tonight, I talk about player to setting fidelity. There's this thing that I've been thinking about, and the term that I'm using for it is player to setting fidelity. I don't know if anybody else has thought in these terms, so maybe there's another term out there that other people are using. But what I mean by this is, so you know how in music recording there's this thing called fidelity, right? Which is if you play an album back in some audio medium and it sounds a lot like if the band were right there in your own home. That's high fidelity, right? Whereas if it doesn't sound that way, then there's a low fidelity. So I mean it's something very similar, which is that fidelity, as I'm using it, means that something is high fidelity in a tabletop role-playing game if the player's action maps very closely to affecting the setting. Okay, so let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about. Example 1, searching a room. So this is a classic OSR example. So the high fidelity version is the GM describes as a study. There's a desk. The desk has 2 drawers on each side. And the player says something like, okay, I open the left bottom drawer. And the GM says, okay, there's a bunch of papers. And the player says, okay, I look under the papers. And the GM says, you find a key. Okay, the low fidelity version of that is the GM says, make a percentage check. Now, the first version is high fidelity because when the player is interacting with the environment, they are directly interacting with it. In other words, they are saying where they search. If you don't search it, you don't find it. So if you don't search the bottom lower drawer, you don't find the papers. If you don't look at the papers and go, I wonder if there's anything under the papers, you don't find the key. Okay, there's no rule made. It's just the way it is, right? But in the low fidelity example, it's low fidelity because the perception check is this intermediary thing that's a game thing. There's a game mechanic there, and it may be like if you have a high wisdom, you have a higher chance. But you're not actually interacting with a setting very closely. There's this perception check that's between the player and the setting. You see what I'm saying? Now, let me give you a few other examples, though, because this is just one example. But I don't want you to think that less rules necessarily means more fidelity. Let's see what I'm talking about. Example 2, a sword fight. Now this is a little bit different. Okay, so a high fidelity example. The game gives you lots of rules for everything that's involved with a sword fight. So there's lunges and feints, thrusts, riposts, all that kind of stuff. Maybe special moves that you can do that are real fencing moves that are simulated by the fencing mechanics. Okay, that's high fidelity because it allows you to work with the actual fencing very much like if you were really there. Low fidelity example. The game has much vaguer rules. It's just, roll a d20 and add your fencing skill or something like that, and whichever side gets the highest wins. Something like that would just be this mechanic, but it's not really geared toward affecting the setting directly. It's this intermediary thing that stands between the player and the setting. If they want to do well at fencing, they just have to have a high fencing skill, but you're not really interacting with, the fencing foils and everything. Okay. 3, magic. Now, magic is kind of a special case because there isn't really a realism to magic. So, how can magic be high or low fidelity? Well, let me look at 2 examples. All right, a high fidelity example would be you have a spell that changes fires. It can raise or lower the temperature. It can, maybe make the fire spread, maybe make sparks fly out, maybe make it smoke a lot. All these things would directly affect something in the setting. Another example might be it could take the fire out. It could snuff torches or something potentially. So there's this sense that even though it's magic, and there isn't really any realism for how magic works, once you know how the magic works, the magic system affects the setting directly. So you're working with what's there in the room. Like if it's a bunch of orcs sitting around a fireplace, you can say, okay, I want to have sparks fly out and fly into their eyes. Okay, great. A low fidelity example would be the classic magic missile. Now, in old school D&D, I'm not really up on how it is in 5e, but in old school D&D, it's like there's this guided missile. It's just generic energy. There isn't really anything to it. It's just, each missile automatically does 1d6 plus 1 points of damage. And depending on your level, you get so many missiles, but you can't really do anything else with it. The only thing you can do with magic missile is you can just damage people. That's it. It's just the combat. And so there's no actual relationship between the player's action and affecting the setting other than simply purely doing damage. That doesn't even have an element associated with it. It's not fire. It can't light things on fire. It can't knock things off. Like you can't say, I'm going to shoot a magic missile at a candelabra and knock the candelabra off the table or something. Like you can't do that. It simply does this thing that just does damage to your foes in combat. Okay, so I would consider that to be low fidelity in terms of a magic system. That these 3 examples, which are each very different from each other, illustrates what I mean. It's not necessarily that rules light is better or that crunchy is better. In the example of searching a room, rules light is actually better because it's just rulings over rules. You just interact with the GM, and there are no rules. You just say what you're searching, and you can do that because in that particular instance, there aren't really any rules needed. If you say you search underneath the papers in the lower left drawer of the desk, you find the key. Okay, in the sword fight, the crunchier rules are actually higher fidelity in that particular case. Now, it doesn't mean that all crunchy rules for a fencing system would be higher fidelity, but in that particular case it is because it's simulating the way a fencing match really would work. Okay? And in the sense of magic, as I said, magic is very, very difficult to have any realism about because magic is fundamentally non-realistic. But in the case of the affecting fires, there's all sorts of things you could do with that to interact with the setting. Whereas in the case of magic missile, you're not. You're simply doing damage to a monster. All right. So I hope you understand the distinction that I'm making. And now the question then becomes, what makes for high fidelity rules or low fidelity rules? And what I would say is that rules light can be really good for high fidelity if it frees things up so that the GM can make rulings over rules. And it just keeps things simple so that you just have only the rules that you need and the GM can figure everything else out. But it's, not so high fidelity if it just kind of leaves things out and kind of leaves you hanging as to, what to do. Like in a magic system, you pretty much have to have rules. You can't have a magic system without rules. And then I think with a rules crunchy system, again, you can have crunchy systems that are high fidelity or low fidelity depending on how much it insists the players in interaction with a setting versus how much is just a bunch of weird rules that don't necessarily correlate very well to the setting. And as a final note, I will note that for me, one thing about Rules Light that I actually really like is that it tends to skew high fidelity because it tends to leave it up to the GM to use rulings over rules, which is really kind of a very critical part of TTRPGs. I mean, that's kind of where Dave Arneson and friends back in the 70s got the idea for TTRPGs, was from these battle tactics games that had referees that allowed you to do things like, okay, how long would it take my troops to break down a barn and build a bridge so I could cross a river and attack the enemy? And the GM or the referee would make up some ruling on the spot, like, okay, it's going to take you 3 rounds, or it's going to take you 1d6 rounds, or whatever, in order to do that. So, anyway, tell me what you think about this, because I haven't really heard anybody talking in these terms. I don't know if there's a different term out there that people are using to talk about this. I don't know if it's necessarily important to everybody. For some people, it seems like they are perfectly happy with having rules that kind of just work the way they work and you just play the game. And for other people, I think, like including me, like to have this sense that your actions affect the setting in a kind of realistic way. Even if we're talking magic, there's sort of some sense that it makes sense why things work the way they work. Okay? And so I'm kind of putting this out there as a thought, and we'll see what everybody thinks about that.